Dorothy Williams adjusted her reading glasses as she stared at the emergency dispatch console, her weathered hands moving across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd spent decades coordinating life-and-death situations. At 65, she'd been relegated to what everyone called the quiet shift at the Riverside Emergency Operations Center in Phoenix, Arizona. The younger staff whispered that dispatch was where they put the old-timers who couldn't handle the pressure of real emergency management anymore. What they didn't know was that Dorothy had once commanded disaster response operations across 3 states, coordinating rescue efforts for hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods that had saved thousands of lives. But that was before the new policies about aging out of field leadership, before she'd been gently pushed into what management called a more suitable role for someone of her experience level. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning shift at the Riverside Emergency Operations Center typically began with the same routine that Dorothy had perfected over the past 3 years. She arrived at 5:30, a full hour before her official start time, using the quiet moments to review overnight reports and prepare for the day ahead. The building hummed with the constant energy of emergency preparedness, banks of computers monitoring weather patterns, communication systems linking to fire departments and police stations across the region, and massive screens displaying real-time data about everything from traffic accidents to medical emergencies. Dorothy had chosen this routine deliberately, finding peace in the methodical preparation that reminded her of her earlier career when she'd managed crisis response teams across the southwestern United States. Back then, she'd been known as Commander Williams, the woman who could coordinate multi-agency responses to natural disasters with the calm efficiency of a conductor leading an orchestra. She'd managed evacuations during wildfires, coordinated rescue operations during flash floods, and supervised emergency shelters during hurricanes. Her reputation had been built on an uncanny ability to see patterns in chaos, to anticipate problems before they became catastrophic, and to make decisions under pressure that consistently saved lives. But that was before the reorganization, before the new emphasis on fresh leadership and innovative approaches to emergency management. The memo had been carefully worded, praising her years of service while explaining that the department was moving toward a more dynamic leadership model that would better serve the community's evolving needs. Translation: she was too old to be trusted with real responsibility anymore. The promotion to senior emergency dispatcher had been presented as recognition of her expertise, a chance to mentor younger staff while handling the critical coordination role that kept the entire operation running smoothly. Dorothy understood the reality behind the corporate speak. She'd been moved to dispatch because it was safe, predictable work that didn't require the split-second decision-making that younger administrators apparently believed was beyond her capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her days taking emergency calls and coordinating initial responses for the same types of disasters she'd once commanded from the field. She'd gone from being the person who made the critical decisions to being the person who relayed information to those who made them. The other dispatchers treated her with the polite respect typically reserved for someone's grandmother, asking about her weekend plans and commenting on the photos of her grandchildren that she kept beside her workstation. They were kind people, but Dorothy could sense their assumption that she was winding down her career, counting the days until retirement, content to handle routine calls and leave the real challenges to others. She'd grown accustomed to being invisible in meetings, to having her suggestions acknowledged with patient nods before the conversation moved on to more practical approaches suggested by younger staff members. Lieutenant Sarah Chun was one of the few people who seemed to recognize that Dorothy's experience might be more valuable than her current role suggested. Sarah worked the overnight shift as a coordination specialist, managing communication between emergency services and field units during the quieter hours when most of the center's senior staff wasn't present. She'd noticed that Dorothy's initial assessments of emergency situations were consistently more accurate than the computer models, that her suggestions for resource allocation often proved more effective than the standard protocols, and that her ability to predict how emergency situations would develop was almost supernatural. During the overlap between their shifts, Sarah had begun asking Dorothy questions about emergency management, genuinely interested in learning from someone who clearly understood the work on a deeper level than most of their colleagues. Dorothy appreciated the young woman's curiosity and had begun sharing insights about disaster psychology, resource management, and the importance of maintaining clear communication channels during crisis situations. Their conversations had become a highlight of Dorothy's workday, a reminder that her knowledge and experience still had value even if the official hierarchy didn't recognize it. The dynamic at the Emergency Operations Center had shifted dramatically 6 months earlier when Commander Blake Stevens arrived as the new Regional Emergency Director. Stevens was 42, a former military officer with an impressive resume that included disaster response experience in several conflict zones overseas. His appointment had been celebrated in the local media as bringing cutting-edge emergency management expertise to the region, and he'd immediately begun implementing new protocols based on the latest technological advances in disaster prediction and response coordination. Stevens represented everything that modern emergency management was supposed to be: data-driven, technologically sophisticated, and strategically focused on efficiency metrics and measurable outcomes. He'd installed new computer systems that could model disaster scenarios with unprecedented accuracy, implemented communication protocols that streamlined information flow between agencies, and established performance benchmarks that held every department accountable for specific response times and resource utilization rates. From Dorothy's perspective, Stevens embodied a troubling trend in emergency management that prioritized technological solutions over human judgment and experience. She'd watched him dismiss suggestions from veteran staff members who'd actually managed real disasters, favoring instead the recommendations of consultants who'd never coordinated an actual emergency response. His approach relied heavily on computer models and predetermined protocols, leaving little room for the kind of adaptive thinking that Dorothy knew was essential when dealing with the unpredictable nature of real emergencies. The first significant clash between Dorothy and Stevens had occurred during her second week on the job, when she'd noticed inconsistencies in the computer models that predicted flash flood risks in the mountainous areas surrounding Phoenix. The models were based on historical data and standard meteorological patterns, but Dorothy's field experience had taught her to recognize subtle warning signs that didn't always show up in the data. She'd approached Stevens with her concerns, explaining that the current weather patterns reminded her of conditions she'd seen before major flooding events in similar terrain. Stevens had listened politely, thanked her for her input, and then explained that the emergency management protocols were now based on scientific modeling rather than subjective impressions. He'd assured her that the computer systems were far more reliable than individual observations, and that the center's resources were better allocated, based on data-driven predictions rather than hunches from field experience. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The dismissal had been professionally delivered, but Dorothy had recognized the underlying message. Her decades of experience were considered less valuable than the latest technology. Similar interactions had followed over the subsequent months, with Dorothy's attempts to share insights consistently met with polite dismissal. Stevens had made it clear that he valued innovation over tradition, technology over experience, and youth over age. He'd restructured the center's operations to minimize the decision-making authority of older staff members, implementing new protocols that required all significant resource allocation decisions to be approved by senior management, effectively cutting experienced dispatchers like Dorothy out of the critical thinking process. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Dorothy. She'd spent her career developing exactly the kind of experience that Stevens was now dismissing as outdated. She'd managed responses to disasters that had killed hundreds of people, coordinated evacuations that had saved thousands, and developed protocols that were still being used in emergency management centers across the country. But because she was 65 and worked dispatch rather than holding an administrative title, her input was considered less valuable than computer models created by people who'd never actually managed a real emergency. The pattern had become frustratingly predictable. Dorothy would notice something in the data or the weather patterns that suggested a developing problem. She'd attempt to share her observations with Stevens or his staff, and her concerns would be acknowledged but ultimately dismissed in favor of whatever the computer model suggested. She'd watched several smaller emergencies unfold exactly as she'd predicted, but by then it was too late for her warnings to matter. The system had been designed to prevent people like her from having real influence over emergency decisions. Sarah Chen had become increasingly frustrated watching Dorothy's expertise being consistently ignored. During their morning conversations, Sarah had learned enough about Dorothy's background to understand that the woman sitting at the dispatch console had more real emergency management experience than most of the senior staff combined. She'd begun asking Dorothy to review emergency plans and resource allocation decisions, using her insights to improve her own performance and better understand how emergency situations typically developed. The relationship between Dorothy and Sarah had evolved into an unofficial mentorship, with Dorothy sharing decades of hard-won wisdom about emergency management, and Sarah providing a channel for Dorothy's insights to occasionally influence actual operations. Sarah had begun incorporating Dorothy's suggestions into her own reports, crediting her with observations that consistently proved more accurate than the standard protocols. It was a small victory, but it represented one of the few ways Dorothy's experience was still being utilized in a meaningful way. The emergency management community in Phoenix had developed a reputation for being well-prepared and technologically advanced, but Dorothy worried that the focus on systems and procedures was creating blind spots that could prove dangerous when facing the kind of unpredictable situations that real emergencies always created. She'd seen too many disasters where the difference between tragedy and successful response had come down to individual judgment calls that couldn't be programmed into computer models. Emergency management, in her experience, was ultimately about understanding people, anticipating human behavior under stress, and making decisions based on incomplete information while lives hung in the balance. Stevens' approach seemed to assume that emergencies could be managed like any other administrative challenge, with the right systems and procedures producing predictable results. Dorothy knew better. She'd seen hurricanes that didn't follow predicted paths, floods that exceeded all historical models, and evacuations that succeeded or failed based on decisions that had to be made in real time without the luxury of consulting computer models. Real emergency management required the kind of judgment that could only be developed through years of experience, the ability to read situations that weren't covered in any manual, and the confidence to make decisions when all the available information suggested that every option was wrong. The weather patterns that had been developing over the past week reminded Dorothy of conditions she'd seen before several major disasters during her field career. The monsoon season in Arizona was always unpredictable, but the current atmospheric pressure readings and wind patterns suggested something more significant than the typical summer storms. She'd been monitoring the data carefully, noting subtle changes that didn't quite fit the standard weather models, but that reminded her of the conditions that had preceded several major flash flooding events she'd managed in similar terrain. Dorothy had attempted to share her observations with Stevens during the previous week's staff meeting, explaining that the current weather patterns were showing signs of instability that could lead to sudden, severe flooding in the mountain areas, where thousands of tourists were currently hiking and camping. Stevens had thanked her for her input, consulted his computer models, and assured the staff that the current weather predictions showed only moderate risk for flash flooding, well, within the range of normal summer weather for the region. The dismissal had been particularly frustrating because Dorothy could see the potential for disaster developing in real time, but the system was designed to prevent her from doing anything about it. She was just a dispatcher responsible for taking calls and relaying information to the people who made the actual decisions. Her job was to follow protocols, not to make judgment calls about resource allocation or emergency preparedness. The fact that she had more experience managing actual disasters than most of the senior staff was considered irrelevant to her current role. As Dorothy prepared for another day of routine dispatch work, she couldn't shake the feeling that the weather patterns were building toward something significant. The atmospheric pressure had dropped more rapidly than the models predicted. The wind patterns were shifting in ways that suggested unusual instability, and the temperature differentials between the valley and the mountains were creating conditions that she'd seen before major flooding events. She'd learned to trust her instincts about weather patterns during her field career, and every instinct was telling her that the region was approaching a dangerous situation, that the current emergency management protocols weren't adequately prepared to handle. The Grand Canyon National Park was experiencing peak tourist season, with an estimated 2,000 visitors currently hiking the various trails and camping in the backcountry areas. Most of these visitors were families with children, elderly, tourists, and inexperienced hikers who'd come to Arizona for vacation rather than serious outdoor adventure. If Dorothy's assessment of the weather patterns was correct, many of these people could find themselves in life-threatening situations within the next 24 hours, trapped in canyon areas that could become deadly when flash floods turned dry creek beds into raging torrents. Dorothy had managed flash flood emergencies before, and she understood how quickly conditions could change from manageable to catastrophic. Flash floods in canyon country were particularly dangerous because they often occurred without warning, turning popular hiking areas into death traps in a matter of minutes. The topography of the Grand Canyon region made evacuation difficult, under the best circumstances, and impossible once flooding began. Prevention was the only effective strategy, requiring early warning systems and evacuation procedures that needed to be implemented before conditions became dangerous. The current emergency management protocols relied heavily on weather service warnings and computer models to trigger evacuation procedures, but Dorothy knew that flash floods often developed faster than the official warning systems could track. She'd seen situations where the difference between successful evacuation and mass casualties had come down to someone recognizing danger signs hours before the official warnings were issued. The kind of pattern recognition that could save lives. In these situations couldn't be programmed into computer models. It could only be developed through years of experience managing actual emergencies. As she settled into her workstation for another day of dispatch duty, Dorothy made a decision that would ultimately change everything. She was going to continue monitoring the weather patterns closely, document her observations carefully, and be prepared to act on her judgment, regardless of what the official protocol suggested. She'd spent too many years saving lives to sit quietly while a preventable disaster developed, even if it meant risking her job or her reputation. Sometimes, experience had to speak louder than hierarchy, and Dorothy was beginning to suspect that this was going to be one of those times. The morning briefing at the Riverside Emergency Operations Center followed the same predictable pattern that had become routine since Commander Stevens took over the regional operations. Dorothy sat in the back row of the conference room, her notebook open, but knowing that her observations would likely go unrecorded in the official meeting minutes. The room was filled with department heads, coordinators, and senior staff who would spend the next hour reviewing computer-generated reports and discussing resource allocation based on algorithmic predictions rather than human judgment. Stevens stood at the front of the room beside a large monitor displaying colorful weather maps and probability matrices that looked impressive, but told only part of the story that Dorothy could read in the atmospheric data. His presentation style was confident and authoritative, the kind of polished delivery that impressed administrators and funding committees but often missed the subtle indicators that separated routine weather events from potentially catastrophic situations. Current meteorological models indicate a 73% probability of moderate precipitation in the northern sectors over the next 48 hours, Stevens announced, clicking through slides that showed rainfall predictions and wind speed forecasts. All indicators suggest standard monsoon activity well within normal parameters for this time of year. Park services report normal visitor levels with no unusual activity or concerns. Dorothy watched the weather data on the screen while listening to Stevens' assessment, noting the discrepancies between what the models predicted and what her experience told her about the developing atmospheric conditions. The barometric pressure readings showed a pattern of instability that the computer models were interpreting as routine weather variation, but Dorothy recognized the signature of a developing severe weather system that could produce flash flooding, far beyond anything the current prediction suggested. She'd seen this pattern before during her years managing emergency responses in similar terrain, most notably during the catastrophic flooding that had struck the Colorado River Basin 8 years earlier. The official weather predictions had called for moderate rainfall and routine storm activity, but Dorothy had recognized the atmospheric instability patterns and had begun coordinating evacuation procedures 12 hours before the first flash flood warnings were issued. That early action had saved an estimated 400 lives when the flooding exceeded all historical records and turned popular camping areas into death traps. The situation developing now showed similar characteristics, with atmospheric pressure differentials that suggested the potential for severe convective activity and rainfall rates that could overwhelm the drainage systems in the canyon regions, where thousands of tourists were currently hiking and camping. The computer models were interpreting the data as routine because they were programmed to look for patterns that matched historical events. But Dorothy understood that the most dangerous weather systems were often the ones that didn't follow predictable patterns. Lieutenant Sarah Chun sat 2 rows ahead of Dorothy, taking notes on Stevens' presentation, while occasionally glancing back with an expression that suggested she was thinking about their earlier conversations regarding weather pattern recognition. Sarah had become increasingly skilled at reading Dorothy's subtle reactions during these briefings, understanding that the older woman's quiet attention often indicated concerns that weren't being addressed in the official discussions. Resource allocation for the next 72 hours will follow standard protocols, Stevens continued, with normal staffing levels and equipment distribution. Emergency response teams will maintain regular readiness status with no additional preparations required. The Weather Service has issued no warnings or advisories that would suggest deviation from routine operations. Dorothy felt her frustration building as she listened to Stevens dismiss the potential for severe weather based solely on computer models that she knew were inadequate for predicting the kind of flash flooding that could develop in the canyon regions. The decision to maintain normal staffing levels and standard equipment distribution meant that if her assessment of the weather patterns was correct, the emergency response system would be completely unprepared for the kind of large-scale evacuation and rescue operations that might be necessary within the next 24 hours. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering administrative details and procedural updates that had little relevance to the developing weather situation. Dorothy used the time to study the atmospheric data more carefully, noting the rate of pressure change and the wind pattern shifts that weren't being properly interpreted by the computer models. Her field experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when routine weather was evolving into something more dangerous, and every indicator suggested that the current situation was far more serious than the official assessment indicated. After the meeting ended, Dorothy approached Stevens as he was gathering his presentation materials, hoping to share her observations about the weather patterns in a more private setting where her concerns might receive more serious consideration. She'd learned that Stevens was more receptive to input when he wasn't performing for an audience, though his fundamental reliance on computer models over human judgment remained unchanged. "Commander Stevens," Dorothy said, keeping her voice respectful but confident, "I wanted to follow up on the weather assessment. I've been reviewing the barometric pressure data and wind patterns, and I'm seeing some indicators that suggest we might be dealing with more severe conditions than the models are predicting." Stevens looked up from his laptop with the patient expression he typically reserved for conversations with staff members who didn't understand the sophistication of the current technological systems. "Dorothy, I appreciate your attention to detail, but our meteorological analysis is based on the most advanced predictive models available. The data is quite clear about the expected weather patterns. I understand that the models show moderate activity," Dorothy replied, "but I've seen situations where the computer predictions missed the signs of severe weather development. The current pressure differentials and wind shear patterns remind me of conditions that preceded major flash flooding events. I think we should consider elevated readiness levels and possibly early warning notifications for the park areas." Stevens saved his presentation file and closed his laptop before responding, his tone becoming more formal as he shifted into what Dorothy recognized as his standard explanation for why technological solutions were superior to human judgment. "Dorothy, emergency management has evolved significantly over the past decade. We now have access to computational resources that can analyze weather patterns with unprecedented accuracy. The days of relying on intuition and guesswork are behind." U.S. The dismissal was polite, but absolute, and Dorothy recognized that Stevens had already made his decision about the weather situation based on the computer models. Her experience and observations were being categorized as intuition and guesswork, rather than professional assessment based on decades of field experience. The conversation was over before it had really begun, and Dorothy understood that pursuing the matter further would only reinforce Stevens' perception that she was an outdated employee who couldn't adapt to modern emergency management practices. As Stevens left the conference room, Dorothy remained behind to study the weather data more carefully, using her access to the emergency management systems to review atmospheric readings and precipitation forecasts from multiple sources. Picture that emerged from her analysis was increasingly concerning, with multiple indicators suggesting that the region was approaching conditions that could produce severe flash flooding within the next 18 to 24 hours. Sarah Chun appeared beside Dorothy's workstation as she was reviewing the weather data, her expression showing the kind of concern that Dorothy had come to recognize in younger staff members who were beginning to understand that the computer models weren't always adequate for predicting real-world emergency situations. "Dorothy," Sarah said quietly, "I've been looking at the same data you were reviewing, and I'm seeing some patterns that don't match what Commander Stevens presented in the briefing. The pressure readings are showing more instability than the models are accounting for." Dorothy looked up from her computer screen, grateful to have someone who was willing to consider that the official assessment might be incomplete. "What specifically are you seeing in the data?" Sarah pulled up a chair and opened her own laptop, displaying weather charts that showed the same atmospheric conditions Dorothy had been analyzing. "The rate of pressure change is accelerating faster than the models predicted, and the wind patterns are showing signs of rotation that suggest developing convective activity. It looks like we might be dealing with the kind of atmospheric instability that can produce severe thunderstorms and heavy rainfall. The conversation that followed was the kind of technical discussion that Dorothy had missed since being relegated to dispatch work, a detailed analysis of weather patterns and atmospheric conditions that drew on both computer data and human judgment to assess the potential for severe weather development. Sarah's questions demonstrated genuine interest in learning how experience could supplement technological analysis, and Dorothy found herself sharing insights about weather pattern recognition that she developed during her years managing actual emergency responses. The computer models are designed to look for patterns that match historical events, Dorothy explained, but the most dangerous weather systems are often the ones that don't follow predictable patterns. Flash flooding in canyon regions is particularly unpredictable because the topography creates its own weather patterns that aren't always captured in the standard meteorological data. Sarah nodded thoughtfully as she studied the weather charts. So you're saying that the models might be underestimating the potential for severe weather because they're not accounting for the unique characteristics of the canyon regions? Exactly, Dorothy replied. The Grand Canyon area has topography that can amplify weather systems in ways that don't show up in standard models. I've seen situations where moderate rainfall predictions turned into catastrophic flooding because the canyon walls concentrated the water flow and created conditions that exceeded all historical records. The technical discussion continued for another hour, with Dorothy sharing specific examples of flash flooding events she'd managed and explaining how atmospheric conditions similar to the current situation had developed into major disasters. Sarah took detailed notes, clearly recognizing that she was receiving insights that weren't available in any training manual or computer model. As their conversation was concluding, Dorothy made a decision that would prove crucial in the events that followed. She was going to continue monitoring the weather situation closely, documenting her observations carefully, and preparing to act on her professional judgment, regardless of what the official protocol suggested. She'd spent too many years managing actual emergencies to ignore the warning signs she was seeing in the current atmospheric data. Sarah, Dorothy said, I want you to do something for me. Keep monitoring the weather data closely, and if you see the patterns I've described developing, I want you to contact me immediately. I don't care what time it is or what the official protocols say. Sometimes experience has to speak louder than computer models. Sarah agreed to monitor the situation, understanding that Dorothy's concerns were based on professional knowledge that deserved serious consideration, even if the official hierarchy wasn't willing to recognize it. The informal partnership between the experienced dispatcher and a younger coordinator represented the kind of collaboration that Dorothy knew was essential for effective emergency management, combining technological resources with human judgment to create a more complete picture of developing situations. The rest of the day passed with Dorothy performing her routine dispatch duties while continuing to monitor the weather patterns that were developing across the region. Her concerns were proving justified as the atmospheric conditions continued to evolve in ways that the computer models weren't predicting, with pressure differentials and wind patterns that suggested the potential for severe convective activity and heavy rainfall in the canyon regions. By late afternoon, Dorothy had documented enough atmospheric data to confirm her assessment that the region was approaching conditions that could produce flash flooding far beyond anything the current emergency management protocols were designed to handle. The weather system was developing characteristics that she'd seen before major disasters, with the kind of atmospheric instability that could turn routine thunderstorms into catastrophic flooding events within a matter of hours. The Grand Canyon National Park was reporting normal visitor levels, with approximately 2,000 people currently hiking trails and camping in backcountry areas that could become death traps if flash flooding developed. Most of these visitors were families with children, elderly tourists, and inexperienced hikers who'd come to Arizona for vacation rather than serious outdoor adventure. If Dorothy's assessment of the weather patterns was correct, many of these people could find themselves in life-threatening situations within the next 12 to 18 hours. Dorothy had managed flash flood emergencies before, and she understood how quickly conditions could change from manageable to catastrophic. Flash floods in canyon country were particularly dangerous because they often occurred without warning, turning popular hiking areas into death traps in a matter of minutes. The topography of the Grand Canyon region made evacuation difficult under the best circumstances and impossible once flooding began. Prevention was the only effective strategy, requiring early warning systems and evacuation procedures that needed to be implemented before conditions became dangerous. The current emergency management protocols relied heavily on weather service warnings and computer models to trigger evacuation procedures, but Dorothy knew that flash floods often developed faster than the official warning systems could track. She'd seen situations where the difference between successful evacuation and mass casualties had come down to someone recognizing danger signs hours before the official warnings were issued. The kind of pattern recognition that could save lives. In these situations couldn't be programmed into computer models. It could only be developed through years of experience managing actual emergencies. As her shift was ending, Dorothy made one final attempt to share her concerns with the appropriate authorities, this time contacting the National Weather Service directly to report her observations about the developing atmospheric conditions. The meteorologist she spoke with was polite but dismissive, explaining that their computer models showed only moderate weather activity and that no warnings or advisories were planned for the region. The response was frustratingly familiar, another example of official channels dismissing experienced assessment in favor of technological analysis. Dorothy understood that the Weather Service meteorologists were competent professionals, but they were working with the same computer models that she knew were inadequate for predicting the kind of flash flooding that could develop in the canyon regions. Their training and experience was focused on general weather patterns rather than the specific characteristics of flash flood development in complex terrain. Dorothy left work that evening with the uncomfortable knowledge that the region was approaching a potentially catastrophic situation that the official emergency management system was completely unprepared to handle. Her attempts to share her concerns had been consistently dismissed, and the current protocols provided no mechanism for her experience and judgment to influence the decision-making process. She was just a dispatcher responsible for taking calls and relaying information to the people who made the actual decisions. But Dorothy had not spent 30 years managing emergency responses to sit quietly while a preventable disaster developed. She'd saved too many lives and seen too many unnecessary deaths to ignore the warning signs she was seeing in the current weather patterns. If the official system wouldn't listen to her concerns, she would have to find another way to ensure that people were prepared for what was coming. That evening, Dorothy sat in her modest apartment reviewing weather data and emergency management protocols, preparing for what her experience told her would be a challenging next 24 hours. She'd seen enough disasters to know that the difference between tragedy and successful response often came down to individual decisions made by people who were willing to trust their judgment and act on their convictions, regardless of what the official protocol suggested. The weather patterns continued to develop throughout the night, with atmospheric pressure dropping more rapidly than the computer models predicted and wind patterns shifting in ways that suggested unusual instability. Dorothy monitored the situation from her home computer, documenting the changes and preparing detailed notes about the developing conditions. She'd learned during her field career that accurate documentation was essential for effective emergency management, providing the kind of detailed analysis that could guide decision-making during crisis situations. By midnight, Dorothy was certain that the region was approaching conditions that would produce severe flash flooding within the next 18 hours. The atmospheric data showed all the characteristics she'd seen before major disasters, with the kind of instability that could turn routine weather into catastrophic events. The Grand Canyon region was particularly vulnerable because of its topography, with thousands of tourists currently in areas that could become death traps if flooding developed. Dorothy made a decision that would ultimately change everything. She was going to continue monitoring the weather situation throughout the night, and if conditions developed as she expected, she was prepared to act on her professional judgment regardless of what the official protocol suggested. She'd spent too many years saving lives to sit quietly while a preventable disaster developed, even if it meant risking her career or her reputation. Sometimes, experience had to speak louder than hierarchy, and Dorothy was beginning to suspect that this was going to be one of those times. The National Weather Service issued its first flash flood watch at 3 in the morning, 12 hours later than Dorothy had predicted based on her analysis of the atmospheric conditions. The watch covered the Grand Canyon region and surrounding areas, warning of the potential for dangerous flooding in low-lying areas and creek beds. But Dorothy knew that the official warning was too little and too late, issued after the dangerous conditions had already begun to develop rather than providing the early warning that could have enabled preventive evacuation procedures. Dorothy dressed quickly and drove to the Emergency Operations Center, arriving to find the facility operating with minimal overnight staffing and no indication that anyone was taking the flash flood watch seriously. The skeleton crew was following standard protocols for routine weather advisories with no additional preparations or elevated readiness levels. Dorothy understood that by the time the official system recognized the severity of the developing situation, it would be too late to implement the kind of large-scale evacuation and rescue operations that would be necessary to prevent mass casualties. Sarah Chun was working the overnight coordination shift, and she immediately recognized the significance of Dorothy's unscheduled arrival at the facility. The two women quickly reviewed the latest weather data, confirming that the atmospheric conditions were developing exactly as Dorothy had predicted. The flash flood watch was just the beginning. Within the next few hours, the situation would escalate into a full-scale emergency that would require immediate action to prevent catastrophic loss of life. "Dorothy," Sarah said quietly, "what do we need to do?" Dorothy looked at the weather data one more time, confirming her assessment of the developing situation. "We need to start coordinating evacuation procedures for the canyon areas immediately. The official protocols will trigger those procedures after the flooding starts, but by then it will be too late. We have maybe 6 hours to get people out of the danger zones before conditions become life-threatening." The decision they made in that moment would ultimately determine whether the developing weather emergency became a routine rescue operation or a catastrophic disaster. Dorothy was about to demonstrate that sometimes experience and judgment were more valuable than official protocols and computer models, and that the difference between saving lives and losing them often came down to individuals who were willing to trust their professional assessment and act on their convictions, regardless of what the hierarchy suggested. The Emergency Operations Center at 4 in the morning had the eerie quiet of a place designed for crisis, but currently experiencing calm. Dorothy moved through the facility with the confident purpose of someone who had spent decades navigating emergency situations, her movements efficient and deliberate, as she began accessing the systems and resources that would be needed for the coordination effort she knew was coming. Sarah Chun worked beside her, quickly learning that Dorothy's approach to emergency management was fundamentally different from the protocol-driven procedures that had become standard practice under Commander Stevens' leadership. Dorothy's first priority was establishing accurate communication with the field units and park services that would be responsible for coordinating evacuation procedures in the canyon regions. The official protocols required authorization from senior management before implementing large-scale emergency responses, but Dorothy understood that waiting for bureaucratic approval would eliminate any opportunity to prevent the disaster that was developing. She began making direct contact with park rangers, search and rescue teams, and emergency services coordinators, using her decades of experience to quickly assess their capabilities and prepare them for the coordinated response that would be necessary. "Sarah," Dorothy said while reviewing communication logs, "I need you to pull up the visitor registration data for all the canyon areas. We need to know exactly how many people are currently in the backcountry areas and where they're located. The official evacuation procedures assume we'll have advance warning from the Weather Service, but we're going to be working ahead of the official timeline." Sarah quickly accessed the Park Service's database, finding registration information for approximately 1,800 visitors currently camping or hiking in areas that Dorothy identified as being at high risk for flash flooding. The data revealed a sobering reality about the scope of the potential disaster. Families with young children, elderly tourists, and inexperienced hikers were scattered throughout canyon regions that could become death traps if flooding developed. As Dorothy's weather analysis suggested, the visitor profiles painted a picture of people who had come to Arizona for vacation rather than serious outdoor adventure. Tourists who were completely unprepared for the kind of emergency situation that was developing. Most had limited wilderness experience and were camping in areas that were easily accessible during normal conditions, but would become impossible to evacuate once flooding began. The topography of the Grand Canyon region meant that many of these locations could be cut off from emergency services within minutes of the first flash flood warnings. Dorothy began developing evacuation priorities based on the terrain analysis and weather predictions, identifying the areas that would be most dangerous if flooding developed and the routes that would need to be used to move people to safety. Her approach was systematic but flexible, drawing on years of experience managing actual evacuations to anticipate the challenges that would arise when trying to coordinate the movement of nearly 2,000 people through difficult terrain. Under emergency conditions, the weather data continued to deteriorate throughout the early morning hours, with atmospheric pressure dropping more rapidly than any computer model had predicted and wind patterns developing the kind of rotational characteristics that indicated severe convective activity. Dorothy monitored the changes carefully, updating her assessment of the timeline and adjusting her evacuation priorities based on the evolving conditions. Her experience told her that they had perhaps 4 to 6 hours before the situation became life-threatening, but that window was narrowing as the atmospheric instability continued to intensify. At 5:30 in the morning, Dorothy made the decision that would define everything that followed. She was going to begin coordinating evacuation procedures immediately, using her authority as a senior emergency management professional to initiate the response that she knew was necessary to prevent mass casualties. The action would be unauthorized, according to the current protocols, but Dorothy understood that sometimes preventing disaster required acting ahead of official procedures rather than waiting for bureaucratic approval. Sarah watched Dorothy transform from a quiet dispatcher into a commanding presence who began issuing directives with the kind of authority that clearly came from extensive field experience. The change was remarkable, revealing the professional competence that had been hidden beneath the unassuming role she'd been assigned. Dorothy's approach to emergency coordination was smooth and efficient, drawing on decades of experience to quickly establish the communication networks and resource allocation that would be needed for successful evacuation procedures. "I need you to contact the helicopter services and search and rescue teams," Dorothy told Sarah, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence even in crisis situations. "Tell them we're implementing early evacuation procedures for the canyon regions based on severe weather predictions. Don't mention that this is unauthorized. Just coordinate the response as if it's been officially approved." Sarah began making the necessary contacts, quickly discovering that Dorothy's reputation in the emergency management community was far more extensive than anyone at the operations center had realized. The helicopter pilots in search and rescue, Coordinators responded to Dorothy's name with immediate recognition and respect, treating her directives as coming from someone with unquestioned authority in emergency situations. It became clear that Dorothy's professional reputation had survived her transition to dispatch work, and that the people who actually managed emergency responses in the field still recognized her expertise. The evacuation coordination began with Dorothy personally contacting the most experienced park rangers and emergency services personnel, people who understood the terrain and the challenges of moving large numbers of people through difficult canyon regions. Her conversations were brief and focused, conveying the essential information about the developing weather situation and the need for immediate evacuation procedures without wasting time on bureaucratic explanations or protocol discussions. Dorothy's approach to emergency management was based on clear communication, efficient resource allocation, and the kind of adaptive thinking that enabled rapid response to changing conditions. She understood that successful evacuation procedures required coordination between multiple agencies and services, with each component understanding their role in the overall operation, while maintaining the flexibility to adjust their approach based on real-time developments. The first helicopter lifted off at 6:15 in the morning, beginning the evacuation of families with young children from the most vulnerable canyon locations. Dorothy coordinated the flight patterns and landing areas using her knowledge of the terrain to identify the safest routes and most efficient procedures for moving people from danger zones to secure locations. The operation was proceeding smoothly, with the kind of professional coordination that reflected years of experience managing actual emergency responses. Commander Stevens arrived at the operations center at 7 o'clock for his regular morning briefing, expecting to find the usual overnight reports and routine status updates. Instead, he discovered a full-scale emergency operation in progress, with Dorothy coordinating evacuation procedures and Sarah managing communication with field units. The scene was completely outside the standard protocols, with unauthorized emergency responses being conducted without official approval or administrative oversight. Stephen's initial reaction was shock and anger at discovering that major emergency operations were being conducted without his knowledge or authorization. His second reaction was confusion about how Dorothy, a dispatcher who was supposed to handle routine calls, had somehow assumed command of what appeared to be a sophisticated multi-agency response operation. The transformation from quiet older employee to commanding emergency coordinator was so complete that Stevens initially didn't recognize the woman he'd been dismissing as outdated for the past 6 months. "What is happening here?" Stevens demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that was accustomed to immediate explanations and absolute compliance. "Who authorized these operations? Why wasn't I notified about any emergency response activities?" Dorothy looked up from the communication console where she was coordinating helicopter operations, her expression calm and professional despite the obvious tension in Stevens' voice. "Commander, we're implementing early evacuation procedures for the canyon regions based on severe weather predictions. The atmospheric conditions indicate high probability of flash flooding within the next 4 to 6 hours." Stevens consulted his computer tablet, reviewing the latest weather data and official forecasts. The models show only moderate weather activity with routine monsoon conditions. There are no official warnings or advisories that would justify large-scale evacuation procedures. You've exceeded your authority and violated multiple protocols. The confrontation between Dorothy and Stevens was being watched by everyone in the operations center, with staff members recognizing that they were witnessing a fundamental clash between different approaches to emergency management. Dorothy represented experience and judgment, while Stevens represented protocol and procedure. The outcome of their conflict would determine whether the developing weather emergency would be managed proactively or reactively, with potentially catastrophic consequences for the difference in timing. "Commander," Dorothy said, her voice remaining Calm and professional. I've been monitoring the atmospheric conditions throughout the night, and the situation is developing more rapidly than the computer models predicted. We have approximately 1,800 visitors in canyon areas that will become death traps if flash flooding develops. The window for safe evacuation is narrowing rapidly. Stephen's response was immediate and absolute. You are not authorized to make those assessments or implement evacuation procedures without official approval. Emergency management protocols exist for a reason, and they require coordination with weather service warnings and administrative authorization. You are exceeding your authority and jeopardizing the credibility of this entire operation. The argument continued for several minutes, with Stevens insisting on adherence to official protocols and Dorothy maintaining that the developing weather situation required immediate action regardless of bureaucratic procedures. The fundamental disagreement was about whether emergency management should be proactive or reactive, whether human judgment should supplement computer models or be subordinated to them, and whether experience should be valued or dismissed in favor of technological analysis. Sarah Chun watched the confrontation with growing concern, understanding that Stephen's insistence on official protocols would effectively end the evacuation procedures that Dorothy had begun coordinating. The helicopter operations would be suspended, the search and rescue teams would be recalled, and the nearly 2,000 visitors currently in the canyon regions would remain in areas that Dorothy's analysis suggested would become extremely dangerous. Within the next few hours, "Commander," Sarah interjected, "I've been monitoring the weather data throughout the night, and I believe Dorothy's assessment is accurate. The atmospheric conditions are showing signs of severe instability that could produce flash flooding. The people in the canyon areas are at significant risk if we don't continue the evacuation procedures." Stevens turned his attention to Sarah, his expression showing surprise that another staff member was supporting Dorothy's unauthorized actions. "Lieutenant Chen, your job is to coordinate routine communications, not to make weather assessments or support unauthorized operations. You are both exceeding your authority and violating established protocols." The situation reached a critical point when Stevens ordered the suspension of all evacuation activities and demanded that Dorothy immediately cease coordinating emergency response operations. The directive was clear and absolute. The unofficial evacuation procedures were to be terminated, the helicopter operations were to be suspended, and all personnel were to return to standard protocols, pending official weather service warnings and administrative approval for emergency responses. Dorothy faced a moment of decision that would determine whether she continued fighting for what she believed was necessary to prevent disaster or submitted to the authority structure that had consistently dismissed her expertise. She understood that defying Stevens' direct orders would effectively end her career in emergency management, but she also understood that following those orders would likely result in mass casualties when the flash flooding developed as her analysis predicted. Sarah Chun watched Dorothy's face as she processed Stevens' ultimatum, recognizing that the older woman was weighing decades of professional experience against the immediate consequences of challenging official authority. The decision would reveal whether Dorothy was willing to risk everything to act on her professional judgment, or whether the system of hierarchy and protocol would prevent her from using her expertise to save lives. The weather data continued to deteriorate while Dorothy and Stevens argued, with atmospheric pressure dropping to levels that indicated severe storm development and wind patterns showing the kind of instability that Dorothy knew preceded major flooding events. The window for safe evacuation was narrowing rapidly, and every minute spent debating protocols was reducing the time available for getting people out of danger zones. Dorothy made her decision with the kind of calm certainty that came from decades of experience managing life and death situations. She was going to continue coordinating the evacuation procedures regardless of Stevens' orders, using her professional judgment and reputation to maintain The emergency response that she knew was necessary to prevent catastrophic loss of life. The action would be insubordinate and potentially career-ending. But Dorothy understood that some situations required individuals to act on their convictions, regardless of the consequences. "Commander," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention, "I've spent 30 years managing emergency responses, and I've never seen atmospheric conditions develop this rapidly without producing severe weather events. The people in those canyon areas are going to die if we don't get them out within the next few hours. I'm not going to stop coordinating their evacuation because a computer model says the weather will be moderate." Stephen's response was immediate and furious. "You are relieved of all duties, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the facility. Your actions today will be subject to full disciplinary review and potential termination. You have violated multiple protocols and exceeded your authority in ways that jeopardize the entire emergency management operation." The confrontation had reached its inevitable conclusion, with Stevens asserting his administrative authority and Dorothy being removed from her position for refusing to abandon what she believed was a necessary emergency response. The evacuation procedures would be suspended, the helicopter operations would be terminated, and the nearly 2,000 visitors in the canyon regions would remain in areas that Dorothy's analysis suggested would become death traps within hours. But Dorothy had not spent 30 years in emergency management without learning how to adapt to changing circumstances and find alternative ways to accomplish necessary objectives. Being removed from her official position would not prevent her from continuing to coordinate the evacuation procedures, and her reputation in the emergency management community would enable her to maintain the response operation through informal channels and personal relationships. As security personnel escorted Dorothy from the operations center, she made eye contact with Sarah Chun, conveying without words that the evacuation effort would continue regardless of official opposition. The younger woman understood that Dorothy's removal from her position was not the end of the emergency response, but rather the beginning of a different kind of coordination effort that would rely on professional relationships and personal credibility, rather than official authority. The weather conditions continued to deteriorate throughout the morning, with the first severe thunderstorms developing in the mountain regions and atmospheric pressure dropping to levels that indicated the potential for catastrophic flooding. Dorothy's predictions were proving accurate, and the window for safe evacuation was narrowing rapidly. Within the next few hours, the situation would become a test of whether experience and judgment could prevent disaster despite official opposition, or whether bureaucratic protocols would prevail regardless of the consequences for human life. Dorothy Williams sat in her car in the parking lot of the Riverside Emergency Operations Center, watching the facility she'd been escorted from while coordinating what would become the most crucial emergency response of her career. Her smartphone was buzzing constantly with calls from helicopter pilots, search and rescue coordinators, and park rangers who were confused about the sudden suspension of evacuation operations and looking for guidance about whether to continue or abort their emergency response activities. The professional network that Dorothy had built during her 30 years in emergency management was now being activated in ways that the official hierarchy couldn't control or prevent. The helicopter pilots who had been coordinating with her for the past 2 hours trusted her judgment more than bureaucratic protocols, and the search and rescue teams understood that her weather assessment was based on expertise that deserved serious consideration regardless of what the computer model suggested. Captain Mike Rodriguez of the Regional Search and Rescue Team called Dorothy directly, his voice reflecting the confusion and concern that many field personnel were experiencing as they tried to understand why a coordinated evacuation effort had been suddenly terminated. "Dorothy, we just received orders to suspend all evacuation activities and return to base. Can you explain what's happening? We've got families with young children in areas that are starting to show signs of dangerous Weather development. Dorothy took a deep breath before responding, understanding that her next words would determine whether the evacuation effort continued, or whether nearly 2,000 people would remain in areas that her analysis indicated would become extremely dangerous within the next few hours. Mike, the official position is that the weather conditions don't justify large-scale evacuation procedures. My assessment is that we're approaching flash flood conditions that could be catastrophic for anyone in the canyon regions. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of Dorothy's statement. He'd worked with her during several previous emergency situations and had learned to trust her judgment about weather patterns and evacuation procedures. Dorothy, what do you need us to do? If you think people are in danger, we're not going to sit on our hands waiting for official approval to save lives. The conversation that followed established the foundation for what would become an unofficial emergency response operation, coordinated entirely through personal relationships and professional trust, rather than official authority. Dorothy began systematically contacting the key personnel who would be needed for successful evacuation procedures, using her reputation and expertise to maintain coordination despite being removed from her official position. Sarah Chun remained inside the operations center, officially continuing her routine duties while secretly maintaining communication with Dorothy and providing real-time updates about weather conditions and official response activities. The arrangement was risky for both women, but Sarah understood that Dorothy's expertise was essential for preventing the disaster that was developing, regardless of what the administrative hierarchy believed about the severity of the weather situation. Commander Stevens had taken personal control of the emergency management operation, implementing standard protocols that called for monitoring weather conditions and waiting for official warnings before implementing any emergency response procedures. His approach was methodical and bureaucratic, following established procedures that prioritized administrative approval over rapid response to changing conditions. The fundamental difference between Stevens' approach and Dorothy's was becoming increasingly apparent as the weather situation continued to deteriorate. Stevens was managing the emergency as an administrative challenge that could be solved through proper procedures and protocol adherence, while Dorothy was treating it as a dynamic situation that required immediate adaptation to changing conditions and proactive measures to prevent loss of life. Dorothy's informal coordination network was operating with remarkable efficiency, drawing on years of professional relationships and shared experience to maintain evacuation procedures despite the lack of official support. The helicopter pilots continued their operations based on their trust in Dorothy's weather assessment. The search and rescue teams maintained their deployment in the canyon regions, and the park rangers began implementing evacuation procedures for the most vulnerable areas. The first severe thunderstorms began developing in the mountain regions at 9:30 in the morning, producing exactly the kind of atmospheric conditions that Dorothy had predicted based on her analysis of the pressure differentials and wind patterns. The storms were more intense than the computer models had forecast, with rainfall rates that exceeded all historical records for the region and wind speeds that indicated severe convective activity. Dorothy monitored the storm development through multiple sources, including direct communication with field personnel, who were reporting conditions that confirmed her worst fears about the developing weather situation. The atmospheric instability was producing the kind of severe convective activity that could generate flash flooding far beyond anything the official emergency management protocols were designed to handle. At 10:15, the National Weather Service issued its first flash flood warning for the Grand Canyon region, acknowledging that severe weather was developing more rapidly than their computer models had predicted. The radio crackled with urgent voices as Dorothy coordinated the unofficial rescue operation from her position in the parking lot, her decades of experience enabling her to manage a complex multi-agency response. despite having no official authority or access to the Emergency Operations Center. The atmospheric pressure had dropped to dangerous levels, and the first reports of severe weather activity were coming in from the mountain regions where thousands of tourists remained trapped in areas that were rapidly becoming inaccessible. Captain Mike Rodriguez's voice came through Dorothy's phone with the kind of tension that indicated rapidly deteriorating conditions in the field. "Dorothy, we're seeing water levels rising faster than anything I've experienced in 15 years of search and rescue operations. The creek beds that were completely dry this morning are now showing significant flow, and the weather radar is indicating major storm cells developing directly over the canyon regions." Dorothy pulled up weather data on her laptop, confirming that the atmospheric conditions were evolving exactly as her analysis had predicted, but far more rapidly than even her most pessimistic projections had suggested. The storm system was generating the kind of severe convective activity that could produce catastrophic flash flooding within hours, rather than the gradual development that might have allowed for orderly evacuation procedures. "Mike, what's the current status of the family groups in the lower canyon areas?" Dorothy asked, her voice maintaining the calm authority that had characterized her emergency management career despite the increasing urgency of the situation. "We've got approximately 300 people in areas that are already showing signs of dangerous water accumulation," Rodriguez replied. "Most of them are families with young children who were planning to hike out later today. The trail conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and some of the creek crossings that were manageable this morning are now looking potentially dangerous." Dorothy understood the implications of Rodriguez's report. The topography of the Grand Canyon region created natural funnels that concentrated water flow during heavy rainfall, turning normally dry creek beds into torrential rivers within minutes of severe weather development. The families Rodriguez was describing were in areas that could become death traps if the current weather patterns continued to intensify. Sarah Chun's voice came through on Dorothy's secondary communication channel, providing updates from inside the operations center about the official response to the developing weather situation. "Dorothy, Commander Stevens is still maintaining that the weather conditions don't justify large-scale emergency response procedures. He's reviewing the computer models and insisting that the current storm activity is within normal parameters for monsoon season." The disconnect between what Dorothy was hearing from field personnel and what Stevens was seeing in his computer models represented the fundamental flaw in the current emergency management approach. The technological systems were designed to identify weather patterns that matched historical data, but they were inadequate for predicting the kind of unprecedented storm development that was currently occurring in the canyon regions. Dorothy had seen this pattern before during her career, managing emergency responses, situations where computer models provided false security about weather conditions, right up until the moment when those conditions exceeded all historical precedents and created catastrophic situations. The difference between successful emergency management and disaster often came down to recognizing when technological analysis was insufficient and human judgment was required to fill the gaps. The helicopter operations that Dorothy had coordinated earlier in the morning were continuing despite the official suspension orders, with pilots making individual decisions to maintain rescue operations based on their assessment of the developing weather conditions and their trust in Dorothy's expertise. The coordination was becoming increasingly challenging as weather conditions deteriorated, but the pilots understood that the window for safe evacuation was narrowing rapidly. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, commanding one of the rescue helicopters, contacted Dorothy with a report that confirmed the most serious aspects of the developing emergency. "Dorothy, we're seeing weather conditions that are unlike anything in our operational experience. The wind patterns are creating severe turbulence that's making flight operations extremely dangerous, and the visibility is dropping rapidly due to heavy precipitation and cloud cover." Dorothy knew that helicopter operations in mountainous Terrain during severe weather required exceptional skill and judgment, with pilots making split-second decisions about whether conditions were safe enough to continue rescue operations or too dangerous to risk additional lives. The fact that experienced pilots were reporting unprecedented weather conditions validated her assessment that the current situation was far more serious than the official emergency management protocols recognized. "Jennifer, what's your assessment of the evacuation timeline?" Dorothy asked. "How much longer do we have before conditions become too dangerous for helicopter operations?" "At the current rate of deterioration, we've got maybe 90 minutes before we have to suspend flight." "Operations," Walsh replied. "The weather is developing faster than any forecasting model predicted, and we're already operating at the edge of safe flight conditions. If we're going to evacuate the remaining families from the high-risk areas, we need to do it now." The conversation was interrupted by an emergency call from one of the park rangers, who was coordinating ground-based evacuation procedures in the canyon regions. Ranger Tom Bradley's voice carried the kind of urgency that indicated immediate danger to the people under his responsibility. "Dorothy, we've got a serious situation developing in the Bright Angel Trail area. The water levels in the creek are rising rapidly, and we've got approximately 50 people, including several families with young children, who are now cut off from the main evacuation routes. The trail conditions have deteriorated to the point where ground evacuation is no longer feasible." Dorothy felt her stomach tighten as she processed the implications of Bradley's report. The Bright Angel Trail was one of the most popular hiking areas in the Grand Canyon, attracting thousands of visitors annually because of its accessibility and scenic beauty. But the same topographical features that made it attractive to tourists also made it extremely dangerous during flash flood conditions, with steep canyon walls that concentrated water flow and limited escape routes. "Tom, what's the current condition of the people who are cut off?" Dorothy asked, already beginning to formulate rescue procedures for what was becoming a life-threatening situation. "We've got mostly families with children between the ages of 5 and 12, plus several elderly. Tourists who don't have the physical capability for emergency evacuation procedures," Bradley replied. "The group includes some people with medical conditions that would make helicopter evacuation challenging, and the weather conditions are making communication difficult." Dorothy understood that the situation Bradley was describing required immediate helicopter evacuation despite the deteriorating weather conditions. The alternative was leaving 50 people, including children and elderly tourists, in an area that would become a death trap if the flash flooding developed as her weather analysis predicted. The rescue would require exceptional skill and coordination, with pilots operating in weather conditions that were beyond normal safety parameters. "Tom, I'm going to coordinate helicopter evacuation for your group," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence even in crisis situations. "Prepare a landing area and get the families ready for immediate evacuation. We're going to get everyone out, but we need to move fast." The coordination that followed demonstrated the kind of emergency management that Dorothy had perfected during her field career, combining technological resources with human judgment to develop solutions for situations that weren't covered in standard protocols. She contacted Lieutenant Walsh to coordinate the helicopter evacuation, while simultaneously working with Rodriguez to position ground-based rescue teams as backup support for the operation. The weather conditions continued to deteriorate throughout the coordination process, with rainfall rates exceeding all historical records and wind patterns, creating the kind of severe turbulence that made helicopter operations extremely dangerous. Dorothy monitored the conditions carefully, making real-time assessments about whether the rescue operation could continue or whether weather conditions had become too dangerous to risk additional lives. Meanwhile, inside the Emergency Operations Center, Commander Stevens was beginning to receive reports from field personnel that contradicted the computer models he'd been relying on for his weather assessment. The National Weather Service had upgraded their flash flood watch to a warning, acknowledging that severe weather was developing more rapidly than their technological systems had predicted. Sarah Chun watched Stephen struggle with the growing disconnect between his computer models and the reports coming in from the field, understanding that the commander was facing the kind of situation that required exactly the expertise he'd been dismissing. The weather conditions were exceeding all technological predictions, and the emergency response required the kind of adaptive thinking that could only come from extensive field experience. Stephen's response to the developing crisis revealed the limitations of an emergency management approach that relied entirely on technological analysis rather than human judgment. As the weather conditions exceeded the parameters of his computer models, he found himself without the tools or experience necessary to coordinate an effective response to the unprecedented situation that was developing. The first flash flood warning was issued at 11:30 in the morning, nearly 24 hours after Dorothy had begun expressing concerns about the developing weather conditions. The warning acknowledged that severe flooding was likely in the canyon regions, but it came after thousands of tourists were already trapped in areas that were becoming increasingly dangerous as water levels continued to rise. Dorothy's informal coordination network had been operating ahead of the official emergency management system throughout the crisis, demonstrating the value of experience and proactive response over bureaucratic protocols and reactive procedures. The helicopter evacuations were proceeding despite official opposition. The search and rescue teams were positioned in areas where they would be needed most, and the park rangers were implementing evacuation procedures that had been developed through years of field experience rather than computer modeling. The rescue of the 50 people trapped in the Bright Angel Trail area required exceptional skill and coordination, with Lieutenant Walsh piloting her helicopter through weather conditions that were beyond normal safety parameters. The operation was complicated by the presence of young children and elderly tourists who required special handling during the evacuation process. But Dorothy's coordination enabled the rescue to proceed efficiently despite the challenging conditions. "Dorothy, we've successfully evacuated 37 people from the Bright Angel Trail area," Walsh reported during a brief break in the weather that allowed for safer flight operations. "We've got 30 more people to evacuate, but the weather conditions are getting worse, and we're approaching the limits of safe flight operations." Dorothy understood that the remaining evacuations would require exceptional judgment about whether the risk to rescue personnel was justified by the danger to the people who remained trapped. The weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate, and the window for safe helicopter operations was narrowing rapidly. The decision about whether to continue the rescue operation or suspend it due to weather conditions would ultimately determine whether the 13 remaining people survived the developing flash flood emergency. The intensity of the storm system had exceeded all predictions, with rainfall rates that were breaking regional records and wind patterns that were creating severe turbulence throughout the canyon regions. Dorothy's weather analysis had predicted severe conditions, but even her most pessimistic projections had underestimated the intensity of the storm system that was currently developing over the Grand Canyon area. Captain Rodriguez contacted Dorothy with a report that confirmed the most serious aspects of the developing emergency. "Dorothy, we're seeing water levels rising at rates that are unprecedented in our operational experience. The creek beds that were manageable for evacuation procedures this morning are now showing dangerous currents that would be fatal for anyone caught in them." The situation was approaching the point where ground-based evacuation procedures would become impossible, leaving helicopter evacuation as the only option for getting people out of the danger areas. But the weather conditions were also making helicopter operations increasingly dangerous, creating a narrowing window of opportunity for completing the rescue operations that were still in progress. Dorothy made the decision that would ultimately define her role in the emergency response. She was going to coordinate the evacuation of the remaining 13 people from the Bright Angel Trail area despite the dangerous weather conditions. Using her expertise and judgment to guide the helicopter operations through conditions that were beyond normal safety parameters. The rescue would require exceptional skill and coordination, but Dorothy understood that the alternative was leaving people to die in an area that would become a death trap within hours. Jennifer, we're going to complete the evacuation of the remaining people from the Bright Angel Trail area, Dorothy told Lieutenant Walsh, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence even in the most challenging situations. I know the weather conditions are dangerous, but those people are going to die if we don't get them out within the next hour. Walsh's response demonstrated the kind of professional trust that Dorothy had earned during her career in emergency management. Dorothy, if you think we can do it safely, we'll make it happen. Your weather assessment has been accurate throughout this operation, and I trust your judgment about whether the conditions are manageable for the remaining evacuations. The coordination that followed would determine whether Dorothy's unofficial emergency response operation would succeed in preventing the disaster that had been developing since the previous evening, or whether the limitations of operating without official authority would prevent the completion of the rescue operations that were still needed to save lives. The weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate, and the window for safe operations was narrowing rapidly. But Dorothy's expertise and the trust of the field personnel who were working with her provided the foundation for what would become one of the most successful emergency rescue operations in the region's history. As Dorothy coordinated the final phase of the evacuation operations, she understood that the success or failure of the rescue effort would ultimately vindicate or condemn her decision to act on her professional judgment despite official opposition. The 13 people who remained trapped in the Bright Angel Trail area represented the difference between a successful emergency response and a catastrophic failure, and Dorothy was determined to ensure that her 30 years of experience in emergency management would be used to save lives, rather than being dismissed by bureaucratic protocols that prioritize procedure over human judgment. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh pushed her helicopter through turbulence that threatened to slam the aircraft into the canyon walls, her skilled hands fighting the controls as she maneuvered toward the improvised landing zone where 13 people waited for evacuation from an area that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. The weather conditions had deteriorated beyond anything in her operational experience, with wind gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour and visibility reduced to less than a quarter mile due to heavy precipitation and swirling cloud cover. Dorothy's voice came through Walsh's headset with the kind of calm precision that provided stability in the midst of chaos, her decades of experience enabling her to guide the helicopter operation through conditions that would have been impossible without expert coordination. Jennifer, the wind patterns are showing brief calm periods every 4 to 5 minutes. You'll have approximately 90 seconds of manageable conditions for each approach. Walsh acknowledged Dorothy's guidance while focusing on the instrument readings that would keep her aircraft stable in the severe turbulence. The helicopter was being pushed beyond its normal operational parameters, but the alternative was leaving 13 people to face flood conditions that would be fatal for anyone caught in the canyon when the water levels peaked. The rescue required exceptional skill and judgment, with split-second decisions determining whether the operation would succeed or result in additional casualties. The group of 13 people waiting for evacuation included 2 families with young children, 3 elderly tourists, and several hikers who had become separated from larger groups during the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions. Park Ranger Tom Bradley was coordinating the ground operations, preparing people for helicopter evacuation while monitoring the rising water levels that were making the trail area increasingly dangerous. Dorothy, the water levels are rising faster than we anticipated. Bradley reported through his radio, his voice carrying the tension of someone watching a life-threatening situation develop in real time. The creek that was ankle-deep this morning is now showing dangerous currents, and we're seeing debris flow that indicates major flooding is occurring upstream. Dorothy understood the implications of Bradley's report. The debris flow he was describing meant that the flash flooding was already occurring in the upper canyon regions, and the water was moving downstream toward the areas where people were still trapped. The timeline for safe evacuation was compressed even further, with perhaps 30 to 40 minutes before the water levels would make helicopter operations impossible and ground evacuation fatal. The first helicopter evacuation attempt was complicated by wind conditions that made stable hovering nearly impossible, with gusts that pushed the aircraft dangerously close to the canyon walls, despite Walsh's exceptional piloting skills. The landing zone that Bradley had prepared was marginal under the best conditions, and the current weather made it extremely hazardous for helicopter operations. "Jennifer, abort the first approach," Dorothy instructed, her voice maintaining the calm authority that enabled clear decision-making under pressure. "Wait for the next wind lull and approach from the eastern vector. The canyon walls will provide some protection from the crosswinds." Walsh pulled the helicopter away from the landing zone and repositioned for another approach, using Dorothy's guidance to find the optimal flight path through the turbulent conditions. The coordination between Dorothy's weather assessment and Walsh's piloting skills demonstrated the kind of professional partnership that was essential for successful emergency operations under challenging conditions. The second approach was more successful, with Walsh managing to establish a stable hover position long enough for 4 of the trapped people to be evacuated. The operation was complicated by the presence of a young child who was terrified by the noise and turbulence of the helicopter, requiring additional time and care from the rescue personnel to complete the evacuation safely. "Dorothy, we've successfully evacuated 4 people," Walsh reported as she pulled away from the landing zone. "The weather conditions are getting worse, and the next approach is going to be even more challenging. The wind patterns are becoming more unpredictable, and the visibility is continuing to decrease." Dorothy monitored the weather data while coordinating the continued evacuation operations, noting that the storm system was intensifying faster than even her most pessimistic projections had suggested. The atmospheric pressure had dropped to levels that indicated severe convective activity, and the radar showed storm cells that were producing rainfall rates exceeding all historical records for the region. The situation was approaching the point where continued helicopter operations would become suicidal rather than heroic. But Dorothy understood that the 9 people who remained trapped in the Bright Angel Trail area would certainly die if the evacuation was suspended. The decision about whether to continue the rescue operation required weighing the risk to rescue personnel against the certainty of death for the people who would be left behind. Captain Rodriguez contacted Dorothy with additional information about the developing flood conditions that confirmed the urgency of completing the evacuation operations. "Dorothy, we're receiving reports of major flooding in the upper canyon regions. The water levels are rising at rates that exceed all our emergency planning assumptions. Anyone who remains in the lower canyon areas after the next hour is going to be in mortal danger." The confirmation of major flooding in the upper canyon regions meant that the water was moving downstream toward the areas where people were still trapped, creating a race against time to complete the evacuation operations before the flood waters reached dangerous levels. Dorothy understood that the window for safe operations was measured in minutes rather than hours, and that every decision about continuing or suspending the rescue operations would determine whether people lived or died. Walsh's third approach to the landing zone was the most challenging yet, with weather conditions that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their operational limits. The helicopter was being buffeted by wind gusts that exceeded safe operational parameters, and the visibility was reduced to the point where instrument flight was necessary, even during daylight hours. "Dorothy, I'm having difficulty maintaining stable hover due to the wind conditions," Walsh reported, her voice showing the strain of operating in weather that was beyond normal safety limits. "The next evacuation is going to require exceptional precision, and I'm not sure we can continue operations much longer without risking the aircraft and crew." Dorothy understood that Walsh was approaching the point where professional judgment would require suspending the rescue operations due to weather conditions that had become too dangerous for continued flight operations. The decision about whether to attempt additional evacuations or suspend operations would ultimately determine whether the 5 people who remained trapped would survive the developing flood emergency. The atmospheric conditions continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon, with the storm system producing weather that exceeded all regional records and created conditions that were unprecedented in the operational experience of the rescue personnel. Dorothy's weather analysis had predicted severe conditions, but the intensity of the storm system was surpassing even her most pessimistic projections. Inside the Emergency Operations Center, Commander Stevens was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the disaster that was developing despite his computer models and bureaucratic protocols. The reports coming in from field personnel were describing weather conditions that exceeded all technological predictions, and the emergency response was requiring exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that he'd been dismissing as outdated. Sarah Chun watched Stevens struggle with the growing realization that his approach to emergency management was inadequate for the current crisis, understanding that the commander was facing a situation that required exactly the expertise he'd been rejecting. The weather conditions were exceeding all computer models, and the emergency response required the kind of field experience that could only come from years of managing actual disasters. Stevens' response to the developing crisis revealed the limitations of an emergency management philosophy that relied entirely on technological analysis rather than human judgment. As the weather conditions exceeded the parameters of his computer models, he found himself without the tools or experience necessary to coordinate an effective response to the unprecedented situation that was unfolding. The first official acknowledgement of the severity of the weather emergency came at 2:30 in the afternoon, when the National Weather Service upgraded their flash flood warning to include language about life-threatening flooding and unprecedented weather conditions. The warning came nearly 30 hours after Dorothy had begun expressing concerns about the developing weather patterns, demonstrating the inadequacy of reactive emergency management approaches. Dorothy's unofficial coordination network had been operating ahead of the official emergency management system throughout the crisis, successfully evacuating over 400 people from areas that were now experiencing dangerous flooding conditions. The helicopter operations had continued despite official opposition. The search and rescue teams had been positioned where they were needed most, and the park rangers had implemented evacuation procedures that had saved hundreds of lives. The evacuation of the remaining 5 people from the Bright Angel Trail area would require Walsh to operate her helicopter in weather conditions that were beyond all safety parameters, with wind gusts that could slam the aircraft into canyon walls and visibility that made instrument flight necessary even during daylight hours. The rescue would require exceptional skill and judgment, with split-second decisions determining whether the operation would succeed or result in additional casualties. "Jennifer, we're going to complete this evacuation," Dorothy told Walsh, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence even in the most challenging situations. "I know the weather conditions are dangerous, but those people are going to die if we don't get them out within the next 30 minutes. Walsh's response demonstrated the kind of professional trust that Dorothy had earned during her career in emergency management. "Dorothy, if you think we can do it safely, we'll make it happen. Your weather assessment has been accurate throughout this operation. and I trust your judgment about whether the conditions are manageable for the remaining evacuations." The coordination that followed would determine whether Dorothy's unofficial emergency response operation would succeed in preventing the disaster that had been developing since the previous evening, or whether the limitations of operating without official authority would prevent the completion of the rescue operations that were still needed to save lives. The fourth helicopter approach to the landing zone was conducted in weather conditions that were beyond anything in Walsh's operational experience, with wind gusts that required constant corrections to maintain stable flight and visibility that made visual navigation impossible. The helicopter was being pushed to its operational limits, but the alternative was leaving 5 people to face flood conditions that would be fatal for anyone caught in the canyon when the water levels peaked. "Dorothy, I'm establishing hover position for the evacuation," Walsh reported, her voice showing the strain of operating in conditions that were testing every aspect of her piloting skills. "The wind conditions are severe, but I think we can maintain stability long enough to evacuate the remaining people." The evacuation of the final 5 people from the Bright Angel Trail area required exceptional coordination between Dorothy's weather assessment, Walsh's piloting skills, and Bradley's ground operations. The weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate, and the window for safe operations was measured in minutes rather than hours. But the professional expertise of the rescue team enabled the successful completion of the evacuation operations. As Walsh pulled away from the landing zone with the final group of evacuees, Dorothy understood that the unofficial emergency response operation had succeeded in preventing what would have been a catastrophic disaster. The weather conditions had exceeded all official predictions, and the emergency response had required exactly the kind of expertise and judgment that the current bureaucratic system had been designed to prevent from influencing critical decisions. The success of the evacuation operations would ultimately vindicate Dorothy's decision to act on her professional judgment despite official opposition, demonstrating that experience and adaptive thinking were essential components of effective emergency management that couldn't be replaced by computer models and bureaucratic protocols. The rescue had required exceptional skill and coordination, but Dorothy's expertise and the trust of the field personnel who worked with her had enabled the successful completion of operations that saved hundreds of lives. The weather emergency was far from over, but Dorothy's coordination had succeeded in evacuating nearly 2,000 people from areas that were now experiencing the kind of catastrophic flooding that would have been fatal for anyone caught in the canyon regions. The unofficial emergency response had operated more effectively than the official system, demonstrating the value of experience and proactive thinking over bureaucratic procedures and reactive protocols. The flash flood that struck the Grand Canyon region at 3:45 that afternoon exceeded every historical record and validated Dorothy's weather analysis with devastating precision. The water levels rose at rates that surpassed all emergency planning assumptions, turning popular hiking trails into torrential rivers and transforming scenic camping areas into death traps within minutes of the flooding's arrival. The canyon walls that had provided scenic beauty for thousands of tourists became funnels that concentrated the water flow into destructive forces that swept away everything in their path. Dorothy monitored the developing disaster from her position, coordinating the emergency response, receiving reports from field personnel that confirmed the catastrophic nature of the flooding while simultaneously documenting the success of the evacuation operations she had coordinated throughout the day. The areas where nearly 2,000 people had been hiking and camping just hours earlier were now experiencing water levels that would have been fatal for anyone caught in the canyon regions when the flooding reached its peak intensity. Captain Rodriguez contacted Dorothy with a report that provided stark confirmation of what would have happened if the evacuation operations had not been completed before the flooding began. "Dorothy, we're seeing water levels in the lower canyon areas that are unprecedented in our operational experience," The creek beds that were ankle-deep this morning are now showing currents that would be fatal for anyone caught in them. The debris flow includes boulders the size of automobiles. The magnitude of the disaster that had been prevented was becoming clear as field personnel reported conditions that exceeded all previous flooding events in the region's recorded history. The areas where families had been camping and hiking were now experiencing water levels that rose 15 to 20 feet above normal, with currents that would have been impossible to survive and debris flows that would have been fatal for anyone caught in their path. Lieutenant Walsh landed her helicopter at the emergency staging area with the final group of evacuees, completing the rescue operations that had successfully removed nearly 2,000 people from areas that were now experiencing catastrophic flooding. The helicopter was showing signs of the stress from operating in weather conditions that were beyond normal safety parameters, but the aircraft and crew had performed flawlessly throughout the challenging rescue operations. "Dorothy, we've completed the evacuation of all personnel from the high-risk areas," Walsh reported, her voice showing the exhaustion and relief that came from successfully completing operations under extremely challenging conditions. The weather conditions exceeded anything in our operational experience, but your coordination enabled us to complete the rescue operation safely. The success of the evacuation operations was being confirmed by reports from throughout the canyon region, with park rangers and emergency personnel documenting that the areas where people had been trapped just hours earlier were now experiencing flood conditions that would have been fatal for anyone caught in them. The informal emergency response that Dorothy had coordinated had succeeded in preventing what would have been one of the most catastrophic disasters in the region's history. Inside the Emergency Operations Center, Commander Stevens was struggling to understand how the weather conditions had exceeded all computer models and technological predictions, while Dorothy's assessment had accurately predicted the severity of the developing emergency. The reports coming in from field personnel were describing conditions that surpassed all official forecasts, and the emergency response had required exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that he'd been dismissing as outdated. Sarah Chun watched Stevens review the documentation of the unofficial emergency response that Dorothy had coordinated, understanding that the commander was facing evidence that his approach to emergency management was inadequate for the kind of unprecedented situations that required human judgment and field experience. The weather conditions had exceeded all technological predictions, and the successful emergency response had been coordinated by someone he'd dismissed as too old and unqualified for modern emergency management. The first official acknowledgement of the disaster's magnitude came at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the National Weather Service issued emergency bulletins acknowledging that the flooding exceeded all historical records and that the weather conditions were unprecedented in the region's meteorological history. The bulletins included language about catastrophic flooding and life-threatening conditions that validated Dorothy's weather analysis, while confirming the inadequacy of the computer models that Stevens had relied on for his decision-making. Dorothy's coordination network began receiving reports from throughout the region that confirmed the success of the evacuation operations, with emergency personnel documenting that nearly 2,000 people had been safely evacuated from areas that were now experiencing flood conditions that would have been fatal for anyone caught in them. The informal emergency response had operated more effectively than the official system, demonstrating the value of experience and proactive thinking over bureaucratic procedures and reactive protocols. The magnitude of the disaster that had been prevented became clear as field personnel reported conditions throughout the canyon region that exceeded all previous flooding events in recorded history. The areas where families had been camping and hiking were now experiencing water levels that rose 20 to 30 feet above normal, with debris flows that included boulders, fallen trees, and destroyed infrastructure that would have been fatal for anyone caught in their path. Captain Rodriguez contacted Dorothy with a comprehensive report about the flooding conditions that provided stark documentation of what would have happened if the evacuation operations had not been completed before. The disaster reached its peak intensity. Dorothy were documenting flood conditions that exceed all historical records for this region. The water levels in areas where people were camping this morning are now showing currents that would have been impossible to survive. The success of Dorothy's emergency response coordination was being confirmed by reports from throughout the region, with emergency personnel documenting that the areas where nearly 2,000 people had been located just hours earlier were now experiencing conditions that would have resulted in mass casualties if the evacuation operations had not been completed successfully. Stevens finally left the Emergency Operations Center to personally assess the disaster conditions, traveling to observation points where he could see the magnitude of the flooding that had exceeded all computer models and technological predictions. The experience of witnessing the catastrophic conditions firsthand provided him with understanding of why Dorothy's weather analysis had been accurate, while his technological systems had failed to predict the severity of the developing emergency. The observation of the actual flood conditions revealed the limitations of emergency management approaches that relied entirely on computer models, rather than human judgment and field experience. Stevens could see evidence of water levels that exceeded all historical records, debris flows that included massive boulders and destroyed infrastructure, and flood conditions that would have been fatal for anyone caught in the canyon regions. When the disaster reached its peak intensity, Dorothy received a phone call from Stevens at 5:15 in the afternoon, the first direct communication between them since she'd been removed from the Emergency Operations Center for refusing to suspend the evacuation operations. The commander's voice carried a tone that was completely different from the dismissive authority he'd displayed during their earlier confrontations, reflecting his growing understanding of the disaster that had been prevented through her coordination efforts. "Dorothy," Stevens said, his voice carrying the kind of humility that comes from recognition of serious errors in judgment, "I need to understand what happened today. The weather conditions exceeded all our technological predictions, and the emergency response you coordinated appears to have prevented what would have been a catastrophic disaster." The conversation that followed represented a fundamental shift in Stevens' understanding of emergency management, with Dorothy explaining how her weather analysis had been based on field experience and pattern recognition that complemented rather than replaced technological analysis. The atmospheric conditions had developed in ways that exceeded computer models, but they had followed patterns that were recognizable to someone with extensive experience managing actual weather emergencies. "Commander," Dorothy replied, "the computer models are valuable tools, but they're not adequate for predicting unprecedented weather conditions. Emergency management requires human judgment and field experience, especially when dealing with situations that exceed historical parameters. The weather patterns we saw today followed signatures that I recognized from previous disasters, but they weren't captured in the technological systems." Stevens listened to Dorothy's explanation with growing recognition of the expertise he'd been dismissing, understanding that her weather analysis had been based on professional knowledge that was essential for effective emergency management. The success of the evacuation operations demonstrated that experience and adaptive thinking were crucial components of emergency response that couldn't be replaced by computer models and bureaucratic protocols. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Stevens asking detailed questions about Dorothy's approach to weather analysis and emergency coordination. The discussion revealed the depth of expertise that had been hidden beneath her unassuming role as a dispatcher, demonstrating that her 30 years of field experience had provided her with insights that were essential for managing the kind of unprecedented situations that exceeded technological predictions. "Dorothy," Stevens said finally, "I made serious errors in judgment that could have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. Your weather analysis was accurate, your emergency coordination was effective, and your decision to continue the evacuation. Operations despite my orders prevented what would have been one of the worst disasters in this region's history. The acknowledgement represented a complete reversal of Stephen's earlier position, with the commander recognizing that Dorothy's expertise was essential for effective emergency management and that his dismissal of her experience had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of what was required for successful disaster response. The conversation concluded with Stevens requesting that Dorothy return to the Emergency Operations Center to help coordinate the ongoing response to the flood emergency. Dorothy's return to the Emergency Operations Center was met with recognition from the staff members who had witnessed her removal just hours earlier, understanding that her expertise had been vindicated by the success of the evacuation operations and the accuracy of her weather analysis. The informal emergency response she had coordinated had prevented what would have been a catastrophic disaster, demonstrating the value of experience and proactive thinking over bureaucratic procedures and reactive protocols. The final documentation of the emergency response revealed that Dorothy's coordination had successfully evacuated 1,847 people from areas that experienced catastrophic flooding within hours of the evacuation operations. The weather conditions had exceeded all historical records and computer model predictions, but Dorothy's analysis had accurately predicted the severity of the developing emergency and enabled the implementation of evacuation procedures that prevented mass casualties. The flood emergency continued for several days, with Dorothy coordinating the official response alongside Stevens in a partnership that combined technological resources with human judgment and field experience. The collaboration demonstrated the effectiveness of emergency management approaches that integrated computer models with professional expertise, creating more comprehensive assessment capabilities than either approach could provide independently. 6 months later, Dorothy Williams was appointed as Regional Emergency Management Director, replacing Stevens, who had requested transfer to a position where his administrative skills could be better utilized in supporting rather than leading emergency response operations. The appointment represented recognition of Dorothy's expertise and the value of experience in emergency management, with her 30 years of field experience finally being acknowledged as essential for effective disaster response. Dorothy's first initiative as Regional Emergency Management Director was implementing training programs that combined technological analysis with human judgment and field experience, ensuring that future emergency responses would benefit from both computer models and professional expertise. The programs emphasized the importance of recognizing when unprecedented situations exceeded technological predictions and required adaptive thinking based on field experience. The Grand Canyon flood emergency became a case study in emergency management programs throughout the country, demonstrating the importance of integrating experience with technology and the value of proactive response over reactive procedures. Dorothy's coordination of the evacuation operations was recognized as preventing what would have been one of the most catastrophic disasters in the region's history, with nearly 2,000 lives saved through the application of professional expertise and adaptive thinking. The story of Dorothy Williams became an inspiration for emergency management professionals who understood that effective disaster response required combining technological resources with human judgment and field experience. Her willingness to act on her professional convictions, despite official opposition, had prevented a catastrophic disaster and demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from people who have spent decades learning to read the signs that computers cannot detect. The lesson of Dorothy's experience was that age and experience should be valued rather than dismissed in emergency management, and that the most effective responses to unprecedented situations often come from people who have spent years developing the judgment and expertise that enable them to recognize patterns that exceed technological predictions. Her story became a reminder that in emergency management, as in many other fields, Wisdom and experience are irreplaceable assets that should be treasured rather than discarded. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.